Welcome to this session on the new and old politics of congressional elections, hosted by the Center for Policy Studies here at Case Western Reserve University. I'm Joe White, the director of the center, and it is a great pleasure to welcome not only all of you, but also Professor Paul Hansen. Paul went to the University of Connecticut in 2013 as professor, and before that he earned his PhD in political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, taught at the University of Massachusetts, and then spent 24 years at the University of Maryland, including 13 as director of the Center for American Politics and Citizenship. During this time, he has been an incredibly productive researcher on subjects including congressional elections, the mechanisms of elections, campaign finance, political parties, and interest groups. His book, Congressional Elections, Campaigning at Home and in Washington, is a superb text on this topic. It's used in courses across the country, and in some sense, just the title became part of the sort of, oh, yeah, that is how it worked when he started, when he published the book. There is campaigning, there are two parts of the campaign here. It was first published in 1995. And the 7th edition will be released shortly. And since he did the research for the first edition, there seem to have been substantial changes in congressional elections, particularly, but not limited to, the rules about campaign finance. So, just before the new edition comes out, it is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Hansen here for a talk and discussion and, in a way, a sneak preview on the new version of the book.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks to the Center for Political Studies and Case Western Reserve University for having me out here to give this talk. I'm just very delighted to be here, and I thank you all for coming on this beautiful day. So, the new and old politics of congressional elections. The old ones. Candidacies are critical to representation. Incumbency confers major advantages. The campaign finance system favors some over others. The new ones, new communications media, what I would now call a new campaign finance system, as opposed to a disintegrated old one, and Republican Party ascendance in Congress. Old politics. Candidacies influence representation. And the story here is to run to get represented. You can't beat somebody with nobody, and if you care deeply about someone representing your issues, your ideology, or perhaps your gender, you need to get them to run or run yourself. Why do we have a Congress of mostly middle-aged, maybe some older, affluent, white male churchgoers? Well, one reason is the incumbency advantage. There's very low turnover in congressional elections. The other example, or the other reason, is the nature of the candidate pool. And the example I will refer to is, or look at, is women. When women run, it's quite clearly women win. We can see that women are about 51% of the population. In 2014, they were 17% of the candidates for the nomination for either major party. They won their nomination and were general election candidates 19% of the time, and now they're 19% of the House members. Women's candidacies by party. This reinforces the point. You can see that bars go nomination candidates, general election candidates, House members, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. If you look at the Democrats, you get 24% who ran for the nomination, 27% who won the nomination, and 33% who became House members. For Republicans, the numbers are lower, 12, 12, and 9, but still, the candidacies are key to getting elected. Now, I choose women because they're a rising group. There are other rising groups in politics, and part of the story of the increasing number of women in Congress and in other offices is that they are now part of the candidate pool. There are more women who occupy positions that are stepping stones, state legislative seats, local offices, They graduate from law schools, they run businesses. So that is part of the story of why things were slow, but why women are increasingly found in Congress. The next thing, incumbency advantages. I put 90%, but it's more typically 95%. When you look at two-party contested races, incumbents win overwhelmingly. Their advantages come from many different sources. Probably one of the most important one occurs prior to the campaign, but then they have advantages in the campaign for resources and the campaign for votes. So we'll look at those. Pre-election advantages. District composition. Well, they were elected there once before, and usually the partisanship of the district closely matches the incumbent's party. There is an advantage. Visibility. Incumbents in a lot of places are sort of recognized. They're local celebrities. The perks of office. You cannot underestimate this. Incumbents have nice offices in the nation's capital, nice offices in their districts. They have franked mail, free telephone, free internet presence, and they have a staff, including a press secretary whose sole job is to educate their member, serve constituents, and if they ever forget that their jobs are dependent on the incumbent's reelection, there's a chief of staff or administrative assistant to remind them. Media coverage. Incumbents get lots of media coverage. When I worked for Congress, we had a very good press secretary, and she would place articles on behalf of our member all the time. And she also had a weekly radio recording. And she would tape the congressman, send it out, and 6 or 7 radio shows played it as if it was a live radio show. The job description. Members of Congress make laws. They represent their districts, their voters. They help their constituents with the federal government. They help them with casework. They oversee the bureaucracy, they educate the public, they do lots of things. A good member of Congress is a great candidate because the job is what we would want. Expectations. Everyone expects the incumbent to get reelected. That has an effect on the next thing here, the quality of the opposition. Why would someone who is a strong potential congressional candidate, a really quality, well-qualified, liked politician, run against an incumbent when the odds of success are so slim? Usually they don't. They wait for the incumbent to retire or maybe some kind of scandal or maybe pass away. They wait till the seat is open. And that brings us to the cycle of self-fulfilling prophecies. Incumbents have these great advantages. They face challengers who maybe aren't the strongest challengers, if they face any at all, and they win. So it just becomes a cycle. And all of this occurs before the campaign season. Now, the two campaigns. The campaign for resources is a campaign for contributions, endorsements, and very important, and more recently, outside support. The timing, it begins much, much earlier than the campaign for votes. People start raising money very early, especially incumbents. The geography, it's nationwide. You can only get votes in your district or for the Senate, your state. But when it comes to money, politicians go where the money is. And that's Washington, D.C. and its environs, New York City and its environs, Los Angeles, that area, Houston. We know the places. It also involves targeting, messaging, and techniques. Knowing who's likely to give to you, knowing a message that will help you raise money, and knowing which techniques work for which donors. The campaign for votes we're all familiar with. It involves targeting, figuring out what groups of voters you need to assemble your winning coalition, coming up with a message that's thematic, that defines your campaign, a champion of middle-class values, a conservative who'll work for you. You've heard these things. It requires all sorts of communications. Direct mail, radio, television, the internet, person-to-person communications, each of which affords different amounts of control. Direct mail, you have a lot of control. You know exactly what you're saying. You know exactly who it's going to. Television, less control because more people watch stations. There's more diversity. Same thing with radio, although if you pick an oldie station and you do it during rush hour, your ad is going to be heard by a group of people that you can guess their age. Social media, the least control. Things go viral. Sometimes they may hurt you. And then there's what I've got put up here, and you're all familiar with voter mobilization. Getting the people who support your candidacy to vote, getting the people that are likely to support your candidacy to vote, and sometimes dissuading, discouraging people who are likely to support the opponent. We're familiar with this. So, campaign for resources. Incumbent advantages. First, they have an experienced organization. They've worked with a fundraiser, or several of them often, for years. They know what they're doing. And that organization comes with its connections. It comes with the record of where the congressman or congresswoman raised money, and with contacts with donors who have contributed to other like-minded candidates. There is a tried and true fundraising list and pitch. When a contribution comes in, the amount is recorded, the medium, whether it was the internet, direct mail, a fundraiser is recorded, the kind of message that was given to the person was recorded. So instead of going out there and prospecting and hoping to find a contribution, incumbents, they know where to go. They know who's given before. Very important. Money is drawn to power. As a member of Congress or some other elected official, you have the ability to influence public policy. And guess what? Your opponent, the challenger, that is not the case. Again, expectations kick in. Everyone expects the incumbents to win, except for a few cases. There's competitive seats, and even there, the odds are pretty good. And so money flows, because for many donors, a contribution is an investment to gain access once the election is over, or continue to have access. And for incumbents, of course, there's near continuous fundraising. You get elected. Most incumbents don't have campaign debts, but they start raising money. They keep the machine going. If they raise a lot to scare off competition. If the competition doesn't appear, they keep raising money, but not as much. It scales off, and it's measurable. So these things are terrific for an incumbent. Challenger is in the opposite position. Usually doesn't have an experienced organization or one that's run a congressional race. Usually doesn't have the same record of donors. Certainly doesn't have the power. Expectations work against you. And incumbents, challengers start raising money later. So the problem for a challenger is there's a catch-22. You need to have resources to get your message out. But given all the disadvantages and the fact that you're really usually very invisible in a race for the typical challenger, you can't raise money. So without the money, you can't raise visibility. Without visibility, your odds of raising more money are not very good, and it's a cycle that feeds on each other. So you have that catch-22. Money is necessary to run a campaign for votes, and without visibility, you can't raise the money, and then you have the cycle I mentioned earlier. The campaign for votes. As I mentioned before, incumbents have a compatible district. They also have high visibility and popularity. About 30% of all voters can, when asked, what's the name of your House member, tell you. What's the name of the House member's opponent? 15% can say. But when you vote, you're not asked. You go in and you see a ballot, and usually you recognize something. That recognition for incumbents is huge, 90%. For challengers, a little over half of that. That's a tremendous advantage. Now let's say, and this also goes into voting cues. You go into the voting booth, let's say you don't know much. Usually you'll recognize the incumbent, but if you don't, you will often recognize the party label next to the incumbent. And since incumbents come from districts that are dominated by members of their party, that's a huge advantage. So an incumbent will start out, because of the things that begin before the election, with a head start. They start earlier with an early lead, and because they have power, the media are drawn to them, and the expectations also advantage them in the campaign for votes. What about the challenger? Again, the opposite situation. It's a catch-22. Campaign dynamics. Incumbents begin with high levels of visibility. Of course, this is a generalization, but most incumbents win and have these advantages. They begin with a high visibility. they're popular, it's hard for them to increase their vote shares. They get the most media coverage and endorsements. That's an advantage. The strategy is usually to maintain support. Reach out a little bit more, but the key is to get those people who voted for you before to vote again. Spending for incumbents has diminishing returns, and it's often defensive. So given they're so well known and so popular, spending a lot of money is not, which incumbents often have, is not going to help them raise their vote share by all that much. And often heavy spending by an incumbent is a sign that the incumbent feels like he or she is in trouble, so it's defensive. In fact, the generalization is the more an incumbent spends, the worse the incumbent does. At least that's for the House. The Senate's a little different. Challengers, they begin with this invisibility problem. Relatively unknown. Local politicians, state legislators or mayors, they have a little more visibility, actually significantly more visibility than the rank amateur, but they're generally not well known. But there are things they can do to help. Somewhat counterintuitively, they can benefit from a contested primary if you win. Why? Because that contested primary is a campaign, in some ways a dry run, but even more important, it attracts media coverage. And so that boost in visibility can add about 3% to a challenger's vote margin. Strategy and spending are very important. It's amazing what some challengers will do in terms of strategy. Spend the money evenly everywhere. Well, we couldn't do research, so we really couldn't target. Oh, spending, oh, we tried a little of this, a little of that, you know, whatever. Challengers who systematically figure it out appeal to their base, appeal to certain groups that are likely to support them. They often, and appeal to swing independents, which you usually need to do because the district is balanced against you, do well. And spending really drives up a challenger's vote share. Challengers also can benefit from national tides. And we've had a number of what they call tidal wave or nationalized elections where things at the national scale, like anger at a president or corruption, bounce checks, whatever, will drive votes. And challengers can benefit from those, including some that would not win otherwise. But the way I like to describe all this when I talk about campaign dynamics is the incumbent is a world-class athlete, let's say an Olympian. The incumbent has a good support staff, the trainers. The incumbent has lots of resources, can train indoors year-round. The incumbent has the home field advantage. The incumbent is expected to win and feels confident. And then you look who the incumbent is running against, and it's a high school track athlete that has none of that. And very often, the high school athlete ends up eating the dust. So a challenger can do everything right, but most lose. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes an incumbent will stumble, but even in some pretty amazing circumstances, like in New York, where there was a congressman named Grimm who had 20 federal indictments against him, the incumbent can win. So it's a pretty tough thing. And I always admire people who run for public office and take on challengers, because sometimes they know what they're up against, sometimes they don't, but the fact that they're in there, they're gladiators, they care about something enough to do something is just a wonderful thing. I've had lots of successful students in political science, but the ones who have run for office are very special to me, because I know what it takes. The campaign finance system, this is the third topic of the old politics. This is 2014 data, and it's for two-party candidates in major party contested elections, and it includes party-coordinated spending because both the party and the candidate have control over that. And you can see, about 35% from political action committees, 45% from what we call significant donors, less from individual donors, and a decent amount from candidates, leadership PACs, party politicians, parties. But you can see that there is sort of a bias here, right? Well-organized and wealthy have a lot of input. The bias is even bigger when you look at PACs. They account for about 1/3 of the money in a House race. And you can see the all-stars, which 250 plus, these are my categories. And the major players, 101,000 to 250. They comprise 27% of the PAC community and account for a whopping 86% of the contribution. So there's this term of pluralism. It's kind of a myth. There's definitely inequalities and a skewed nature in the PAC community. Those inequalities exist among different economic sectors too. And really the thing to notice is this down here. You know, millions of money to parties and candidates. You know, financial, real estate do quite well. Ideological issue groups do well too, but that group, you know, it also includes party leadership PACs. Businesses, they do well, and you can see that some of these groups favor one party or the other. But guess what group is not on the chart or from the source, Center for Responsive Politics? Nannies and laborers. How much does their day laborers that aren't unionized, how much do they give? They're nowhere, and they have important jobs. We always treated our nanny exceedingly well and still keep in touch with her even though my son is 7. Well, inequalities from the sources, inequalities among the recipients. In 2014, the incumbents averaged about 1.7 million. That average is kind of messy. If you take a look at party leaders, they raise a lot more. Some of you know a former speaker named Boehner. He was like in the $17 million range. Committee chairs and ranking members do quite well. Policy entrepreneurs, people who are known for championing certain policies, particularly those that will help banking or the healthcare industry, whatever, they raise a lot of money. And of course, incumbents in jeopardy, those who have a chance of losing their seat, they also raise considerably more than this average. Challengers raise on average quite a bit less. Those in close races raise much more than average, and political experience is an important predictor of the amount a challenger can raise. Open seat candidates, they always raise a lot of money. The racers are not always among equals. There are some advantages, partisanship and other things that some have over others, but they raise a lot of money, and those in close races and those with political experience do quite well. So, the old, the new. What's new? New communications media. Those are pretty important. I'm going to focus mostly on the internet, but subscription media, cable, satellite TV are in here, and social media are very important too. One advantage, relatively inexpensive. Another advantage to this social media is you do have moderate message control. When you talk about internet websites, campaign websites, one aspect of them is they're really voter initiated. Candidates can point people to their websites. They buy services that pop up and get people to a website. So you have incredible message control. You have the problem of somewhat a static audience. Pop-ups, which I think most of you are familiar with. The ad comes on when you go to a website. They can be targeted, and they can be controlled. So that's pretty good. And it doesn't take as much voter initiation. And then there's this viral thing where people put things on their websites or things go out in social media, and they go everywhere. And those don't have that much control. And sometimes a commentary by someone who is trying to help you, and I see some smiles out here, may not be so helpful. The other advantage to these media, particularly the internet, is they allow for data collection. When one of us visits a website, sports, the news, our information goes there. When someone visits a candidate's website or a party website and tours around, where you went is there. And so there are firms now that will help with this aspect of data collection, and they will sell data that is useful in targeting and directing where these pop-ups and other communications will go. The internet, as you know, is really great for fundraising in terms of attracting small contributions, under $200 usually. Act Blue has had a wonderful success, raising over $60 million in 2014. You go there, you pick a candidate, press a button, and it goes. And the advantage is, unlike a piece of direct mail, it doesn't cost much. And unlike a piece of direct mail or a telephone solicitation, you see a debate, you hear some news, you get motivated, you can do it when you want. If you're waiting or you call up a campaign, that contribution may not happen. The next thing is message testing. So I have a few friends that are political consultants and work for pretty big firms, and the way they explain it is they have the ad. They have 3 or 4 versions. They get those versions out there, and they do side-by-side comparisons. And they make sure they get them to groups that they're looking to attract. So the side-by-side comparisons also includes the effect on different blocks of voters that they want to be part of their winning coalition. Well, the message testing can be simple. You log on, you watch a satellite or cable TV show. Before you go anywhere at a certain type, it pops up. They know whether you've watched it to completion, which is a sign of success, or whether you've not, or another thing is whether you've emailed it, the link, or recommended it to someone else. So it's very useful message testing for ads that later appear on TV but also stay on the internet. Now, sorry about this one, venues for uncoordinated coordination. Independent expenditures cannot be coordinated. Groups spending by political parties or outside groups that are called independent expenditures cannot be coordinated with a campaign. You cannot give a candidate cannot communicate with you, you cannot communicate back. There are ways around this, including staffing, and one of the ways is to post a website, which is public, and let certain people know about it. And you can put some of your B-roll, some of the campaign ads you might run, some of the things that you want other people to notice, and your allies out there that you're not allowed to coordinate with know you have this public website. And some of the communications are like I described. Other communications on these sites are things like, ooh, saw that independent expenditure down in the southern part of my district. It was great. Love to see it somewhere in the northern part, particularly in this media market. But no, not communication. So I guess I just got stuck and called it uncoordinated coordination. It's a shadow dance between an independent spending group and a campaign. New campaign finance system. So this is going to take a little while. I hope I don't bore you. In the beginning, interest groups that wanted to participate in congressional and federal elections had to form a political action committee. Political action committees could raise $5,000 from an individual, could spend $5,000 in a campaign, had to disclose all their spending and their contributions, and they were the federal election arm of an interest group. After the Citizens United ruling, we ended up with alphabet soup. We have the political action committees, the traditional PACs, and there are these independent expenditure-only things called super PACs. They can't make contributions, but they can raise money in amounts and from sources that candidates cannot. And some of those sources are disclosed, and some of them, most of them, but some of them are not. 527 committees, I don't want to say too much about. They're groups that can raise money, but they're really going out of fashion a little bit. And then we get to these 501c4, 5s, and 6s, which are social welfare organizations. They can raise money from wherever they want. They cannot contribute it, but they can make independent expenditures, and they don't have to disclose. They disclose where their money comes from to the IRS, but the IRS does not make it public. There is a disadvantage to these. Besides the inability to make a contribution, the rule of thumb is, as it currently stands, one of these groups cannot spend more than half of its money on politics. The other half, or electioneering. So, like that's the 49 or /50% rule. Some of that goes to other organizations with like-minded views who can spend it on elections, but they have this 50% cutoff. And of course, Citizens United unleashed spending, independent spending by corporations, trade associations, labor unions, other incorporated groups. They were basically treated like people in terms of free speech. Actually, before we go to this, I want to just say a couple of things. So the old system, disclosure, transparency, you could hold a candidate, a party accountable for where their money came from, because you could find out. The other thing, a very important principle, was limits of sources, limits amount you could raise. And then the third one was every contribution in a federal campaign, every expenditure in a federal campaign originated with a voluntary contribution from an individual. That's where that money started from. Now it's very different. Some of the money's hidden. and some of it's from corporate treasuries and groups that these corporations, trade associations, others, individuals founded. And there is no stockholder saying, yeah, spend all my money blasting Portman or some other candidate. So here's how complex things can be. This is the League of Conservation Voters. It's been around a long time. It has this 501c3 education fund. That group does research and puts together lists of the Dirty Dozen, environmental champions. It's the research arm. Then there's this accountability project, which takes that research and publicizes it in ways to help or hurt certain candidates. Then there's the Political Action Committee, which gives contributions to candidates and can make some independent expenditures. Then there's the Super PAC, which makes independent expenditures. And then there's the 527 Committee, which doesn't disclose where its money comes from and mostly gives it to state and local affiliates for their campaign and political activity. So it's a complex world. It's like architecture. You have a cause, and some building regulation comes in, so you build new kinds of structures to accommodate it and accomplish your goals. Interest group spending in 2014. PACs, contributions, and independent expenditures, about 47% of what was spent by interest groups. Super PACs, pretty new on the scene, 27%. Electioneering communications, tiny sum. Corporations, and 501c and other groups, about 20%. I'll talk a little bit about single candidate super PACs later, 501c's, nonprofits later, and it's only 1%, and I'll talk more about this later too, single candidate super PAC independent expenditures, which, although only 4% of the total, were 11% of the money spent in the campaigns that they participated in. Interest group outside spending. Here's the PACs. You know, a little more positive than negative. Internal communications, these are for fundraising for PACs, those sorts of things. Not much going on. Here's the new groups, much more negative. And here's the groups that don't have to report how they spent the money, just say they did. And this is mostly negative too. So it's the new campaign finance world is an uglier world. The effects of outside spending. It's not a race between two candidates anymore for some elections. There's a small group of elections, competitive, where outside spending can shift the balance of communications. There was about more than $650 million spent outside in 2014. There were 18 House races where parties and interest groups outspent both candidates. There were 47 races where the groups outspent one candidate, usually the incumbent. California 7, more than $13 million in outside spending took place. In the Senate, there were 10 races where outside groups outspent the candidates, and about $80 million in the North Carolina race, $60 million in Colorado. That's big money. And again, this is money that's from sources that the candidates can't touch. It's mostly negative, makes it very difficult for a candidate to anticipate or respond, because remember, a lot of this money isn't reported, so the candidate can't go to the FEC and check things. Voters don't get balanced information about the election, and the accountability between what a candidate says he'll do and what a member of Congress does, maybe what she'll do, is very weak. And of course, all of this drives up the costs of campaigning. The new faces of campaign finance, who knows who these people are? The Koch brothers. Here's the terror the Koch brothers had in 2014. Imagine being in one of these races in August and seeing all the money that was thrown against you by the Koch brothers in North Carolina. It didn't progress at this rate, but you can imagine how the candidates reacted, how they felt the need to raise more money, how they were very uncertain about their future. Well, let me say one more thing about this. The Koch brothers are the face of it, but they're not the only ones. Now hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. This is Mark Begich, former senator from Alaska. And there was this single candidate super PAC that could not coordinate with him. And like most of them, it had former aides and supporters running it that knew what he would do. And although he lost, they spent a lot of money to help. Mitch McConnell did well. Orman, an independent, did pretty well. These are shadow campaign committees. They raise money from sources that the candidates can't. and they spend it to help the candidate. And these are committed to the advancement of one politician's career. So these are a little scary. What has this new politics of campaign finance done? Well, it's increased the inequalities in campaign finance. 2014, about 100 people spent $305 million or made contributions to these groups, candidates, parties, PACs, super PACs, 527. That was 98% of the contributions these groups got. We can't be sure of how much corporations, associations, unions, and other groups gave to some of these committees because the 501c3s don't report, and no one knows really the amount. But we know that overwhelmingly, a few groups accounted for most of the money. What does this do? Well, it increases the influence of wealthy and organized groups. It reduces transparency in campaign financing. It blurs lines of political accountability, and it also leads to skyrocketing campaign costs. Last part of the new politics, Republican ascendance in Congress. First point, political geography. Couple of things going on here. There's a sorting out of the population. Democrats like to live near Democrats. Republicans increasingly live near Republicans, more so now than before. Unfortunately for the Democrats, they're packed in urban districts, so their votes are not distributed as efficiently. Then there's partisan realignment, especially in the South. The way this starts is you've got the solid Democratic South. They're attracted to some Republican presidential candidates, and they support them. And over the decades, that support trickles down. And so the Republicans that were once barely represented by the South now make up most of their Republicans make up the most of Southern congressional delegations. Redistricting, improved technology, computer programs, better data, great. Majority minority districts. These districts created to elect minority candidates, mostly African Americans, have accomplished their goal. But in drawing these districts, the districts around them have become increasingly Republican, especially when Southern legislatures do it. The next thing, there is incumbent protection. All incumbents, regardless of party, try to help each other out. And that helps incumbents of both parties, but what's different is this, the partisan control of the process. The Republicans, during much of the 19th century, had control of few state legislatures, few governorships. Now they control most. So they have a huge impact on redistricting. And that accounts for some things in the House. Doesn't account for the Senate, but it accounts for the House. And then the last bullet here is the growth of the Republican farm team. How many of you know the name Newt Gingrich? Everybody. How many of you have heard of GOPAC? Some. So when Gingrich was elected, he had this organization, a leadership pack called GOPAC. And he would travel around the country and give out books and videotapes they used back then and give lectures. And the idea, and he did this with the Republican National Committee, very effective, was to sort of build some grassroots activity at the local level. And they've been highly successful. Republicans have captured lots of state legislators, done really well with governorships, and when you have a good farm team, you can compete. And the Republicans have done exceedingly well there. What to expect in 2016? Well, the presidential election. I'm guessing it'll be Clinton versus an establishment Republican. I put maybe Bush there because he's got a lot of money. His campaign money, but even more, his single candidate super PAC money. And everybody's counting him out. But I think it'll be an establishment Republican, Bush, or probably more likely Rubio, but I'm not sure. The presidential election will dominate the campaign agenda, dominate the issues that are discussed, dominate the news coverage, dominate fundraising, and dominate voter decision-making, including the decision whether to turn out to vote. Congressional candidates will respond strategically. Those who live in districts where their party's presidential candidate is very popular will try to ride the wave. Those who live in other districts will be the independent Democrat, the voice of independent Republicans, or one of those people who runs against DC even though they may be an incumbent. But they will separate. Republicans, as the majority in the House and Senate, will enjoy fundraising advantages. The Democrats had them before. I think they'll maintain control of the House. The Senate, I will defer to you folks on that one. I think it will be contested. So the conclusion, this talk is about continuity and change. From the old politics, candidacies still are incredibly important for representation in Congress and elsewhere. Incumbency advantages, they come from what an incumbent does prior to the election and the resources at an incumbent's disposal. And they have advantages, obviously, in the campaign for resources and the campaign for votes. The new politics, there are new communications media, and candidates need to use them. There is the decline of the old campaign finance system and the rise of the new one. But in the new politics of campaign finance, the inequalities persist, and should have written are exacerbated. Actually, the problem was it wouldn't fit in the slide. And then we have the Republican ascendance in Congress, which is largely the result of their ascendance in state and local offices. One of the messages here is that organized groups can adopt a change. And candidates and interest groups and parties clearly have done that by creating new groups and things. Another one is I'm sure there will be further disintegration of the old campaign finance system until maybe there's reform. I'm not so positive about that. And then there will be competition for control of Congress, and polarization will continue. If you want to know more, here's my shameless plug for the book. And as my son says, always say thank you and ask people if they have questions. So thank you very much.
And thank you very much. Since we're recording this so that people could actually hear what questions he answers, I'd like to, Mr. Digby here will carry the microphone around to those of you who have questions so you can ask something. Does anybody immediately have one? Okay.
I'm sort of an imposter in the room. I'm a sociology PhD student. But I'm very interested in your take on recent ballot measures to curb the sort of gerrymandering that's created more Republican districts, in effect. Ohio just passed one on Tuesday. It's a bipartisan committee that's supposed to be fair, equitable, transparent in drawing redistricting lines for Congress in Ohio. So my question is, what do you think of these committees and their potential for success?
Well, if I was an incumbent, my answer would be, of course they're fair when they draw the districts that help me. There is a little empirical evidence. So Iowa has had a commission system for a very long time. And while 10%, actually less than 10% of House races are usually competitive nationwide, Iowa has consistently had 4 out of 5 races that were competitive. Another bit of evidence. California recently passed a new redistricting system and also their top 2 primary system. So it's hard to disentangle the effects of those two. But prior to that, those reforms being instituted, very few races in California were competitive. I think in 2010, maybe there were 3 or 4 that two-party contested races that were decided by less than 20% of the vote. If you look at 2014, there were a heck of a lot more competitive races. So I think it could be helpful. I guess anything can be helpful, right? And then at some point, people will learn how to game it, and maybe things will revert. But I think that if competition is your goal, which it probably should be, I think they're a good idea. Yeah.
The one in Ohio just applies to the state legislature.
Well.
It doesn't apply to Congress, unfortunately.
Sorry, excuse me?
Well, that's okay. That's a start. We'll see how it works.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Fine by me.
So a follow-up question to that is, you framed it in terms of competition, but competition also draws more dollars and more PACs, which are of dubious transparency at best, as you've so well explained. Do you think more competition is good as a goal?
Well, so I think what's behind your question, and you can correct me, is that competition increases campaign costs, right? Well, if we're going to have a privately funded campaign finance system, which we have, we need to think about the competition. The competition is two general election candidates, Democrat, Republican, or in California, maybe two of the same party, maybe some third-party people. That we know. The competition can be a Senate race, a gubernatorial race, a presidential race. So your message as a candidate for the House is competing against all of that. And that's not to mention Coke and Pepsi, which spend bazillions of dollars on advertising. So if more competition drives up the costs, we live in a democratic federal republic that's nicely nestled in a post-capitalist economy, and you can't take money out. I don't worry so much about that. I would propose a lot of campaign finance reforms, and we can talk about that later. I think I'll give someone else a chance to ask a question first. Thank you. They're really good questions.
How much do you think that Citizens United has increased the ability of foreign money coming into our national elections, but also congressional elections?
Well, that's a great question. Foreigners are not supposed to be able to spend. In a world order like ours, where not most, but many corporations, and especially big ones, are multinationals, they have U.S. subsidiaries. Those U.S. subsidiaries, or corporations here, and their money goes in. The question is, how much foreign money goes in? Well, if the money is going to a 501c, we may never know. Remember, money is fungible. It just flows. So we really don't know. But I can give you a little anecdote that goes back to the old campaign finance system before it crumbled. I was asked to do a political audit by a company that I will not mention their name. It was a multinational. You would know of it if I said the name. We talked on the phone. They said, come on down for a meeting. And I said, look, if I'm going to come down for a meeting, I don't want to just meet your team. I want to present something so that you can see what I do, and we can decide whether to move forward. And also, if I'm going to do something, I want to be paid for it. So I went to this meeting, and I talked to their PAC director was there, and I said how his strategy looked good. I thought they maintained access. I thought that he was very smart about holding some money back for kiss and make up money to give to challengers who defeated the incumbents they backed, and everybody beamed. And then I said, but there's this guy, ba, and he maxed out to your PAC, and I know where your company is based, and his surname and first name match. Is he a U.S. citizen? It got quiet. The meeting ended. A few weeks later, I got a check in the mail for the work I had done, and the relationship was over. The key point, you could find out. And they did, and I did, and then you could find out what happened later. And sure as heck, a couple weeks later, I looked up their FTC reports, and there was a refund to this, overly excited foreigner who thought he was going to change the nature of American politics through a maximum contribution. But that doesn't happen anymore. So I guess we don't know. But I don't think foreign money is overwhelming our system. But still, we don't know. It's a great question.
I'd like to pose one, if I may.
Uh-oh.
There seems to be a rather large difference in turnout between congressional elections and between off-year elections and on-year elections. I don't want to say that fundamentally favors Republicans because Republicans are more likely to turn out, because obviously 2006 would be an exception, but it looks like the turnout in off-year elections is likely to be usually somewhat more Republican, or it could be. It also, it seems that one of the factors in the farm team issue and in control of redistricting might be that the vast majority, if not all governorships, I'm not sure that there are very few governorships now that are elected the same year as the president, as far as I know. So what's your perception about the differences between the congressional election constituency and the presidential election constituency?
Well, I'll just point out that in 2014, we had a record low turnout. which speaks to the point you're making, and I agree with you. I think the voters are different. The electorate for the presidential election usually has more young people, more people who aren't as heavily engaged in politics, more minorities, particularly if you have a President Obama running, and so that helps Democrats. During the other years, when these people don't turn out, young people don't show up, Republicans are advantaged. Making it even more challenging when we talk about redistricting and who controls state governments is there's over a dozen states that have their state elections in odd years, where turnout really matters a lot. I just voted in an election in Connecticut. There are probably less than 1,000 people who voted for mayor. And imagine, if we were selecting state legislators who were going to control redistricting. That small hardcore that shows up has tremendous power. So it's a structural issue, and it's there. Now, do we want to make sure all governors and state legislators get elected during presidential election years? Well, maybe some of those local issues and those local campaigns will not be heard, and that would be an argument against it. I'm not sure where I come down on that. It's a very thought-provoking question, and I will think about it some more. Other questions? Yes?
In terms of,
Well, I can hear you.
Sorry. It's okay. In terms of, presumed malapportionment and so on, gerrymandering issues, a lot of people blame gerrymandering and so on by state legislatures. But then I've read other accounts which say that really the vast majority of that comes from the kind of geographical, factors you were speaking about, liberals clustering in big cities and so on. Do you have a sense of which is really more important?
That's a chicken and egg one, and I'm not sure I can, to be frank, answer that. But I'll go home and look for some scholarly work and get back to you. That's what I do in my class. If someone asks me a question, I don't know the answer, I'm pretty frank about it. Okay. I would think, though, I think you have to begin with the sorting out before gerrymandering can happen. So I think I would put somewhat more weight in that, but others really have expertise on this. Stump the guest lecturer.
When they opened the door on corporate money, I had a sense that there's going to be a big rush of that. And then, I haven't actually looked this up, but anecdotally, the way I remember it is that some of the early players, Target was one, got kind of burned, and people started talking about boycotting them. We're not going to shop there and all that kind of stuff. And they got, corporations are these large corporations that in retail businesses have a lot of sensitivity about their image and don't want to have any enemies. And so I had some sense that they backed away. But number one, has that really happened? And number two, are they just now funneling it all through these other vehicles where it can be unreported? Are corporations, do we have ways of finding out what, at least maybe not even where it's going, but how much in a corporate budget is being spent on that kind of activity?
That is a great question, and I do have a little empirical evidence. So as you stated, some companies withdrew. We know that the money didn't disappear, so quite a bit of it is going into these 501c groups. We also know that between 2012 and 2014, when we look at super PACs, the amount that was disclosed, or the amount shrunk. So other super PACs, which don't get some of their money from disclosed sources, and these social welfare, politically active social welfare organizations have begun as a tactic to give more money to these outside super PACs. So there is some evidence there that the money has, to some degree, gone underground. Not all of it, but quite a bit of it. And it's for defensive reasons. It's also, in some cases, makes the candidates more comfortable. They can't control what these shadow groups do, although they certainly have this indirect influence. And they may be sensitive to being seen as captured by Target running ads for them. So they also have good reason to prefer that some of this money get funneled into these shadow groups that don't disclose. So there is evidence that the trend has taken place, and there's reason for it. But not every group has done that. I think the probably in some ways the most troubling point is that the sources of these monies. Stockholders may disagree with where their company is spending its political money. Consumers may disagree with it, and yet there is no control. It's very different than the money that people voluntarily put into political action committees or gave to campaigns, because this is something that the chairman of the board and the public relations officer and those the leaders decide what to do on their own. And in some cases, it raises the question. I mean, the question's been raised about a lot of corporations. Do their leaders really represent and advance the views of their stockholders, or are they more interested in feather bedding their own nests and getting golden parachutes? And politically, I'm sure that some of the groups that stockholders, some of the companies stockholders invest in, do not represent the political views of their donors. So this.
Well, the Wall Street Journal doesn't find that as troubling as they do the way labor unions spend their money.
Well, that's right. And labor union money is small sums, and you can always opt out. The Wall Street Journal has its own view. I mean, just like the New York Times and the Baltimore Sun and the Hartford Courant too. Yeah. Good question. Wherever the microphone goes. Yeah.
So I just had a quick question. I missed the first couple of minutes, so I don't know if you already addressed this. How did the change in campaign finances affect the type of candidates, and also what issues were predominantly apparent in election cycles?
Okay, so how did it change the types of candidates? It's pretty early on to tell that, but one of the questions that's always asked of a potential candidate by a political party or potential funder or a campaign consultant is, where are you going to get your money? Can you run this campaign? Some candidates mortgage their houses to start, and they point to the network of realtors, their realtors, and how they can work that group first and then move to Washington, which is the normal strategy. But now the question is the one that I just raised, but also, is someone putting together a super PAC to help your campaign? And that's a new consideration. So I'm not sure what effect it has on candidate emergence, but it's certainly where your money comes from, and is if there's a group that can give large unregulated sums to support you, does it exist, becomes an issue. Money usually discourages candidacies, though, not encourages them.
Good question. I've got another one, sorry. Most of this talk really, I mean, the numbers and so on, really say House to me, right? Okay? The Senate is the Senate really the same story? Obviously, the vehicles for raising money have changed in the same way, but do you see distinctions in the trends for Senate races as opposed to House races?
Yeah, so the reason why most of the talk is about the House is because there's lots of House races, there's lots of variation in districts and in competition in candidacies. The Senate, typically 1/3 is up for election. So I guess one thing I could say in terms of outside money and Senate races, the answer is more. The most expensive race in terms of outside spending for the House in 2014 was $13 million. North Carolina, Senate, $80 million. Colorado, Senate, $60 million. So the answer is just more. There's more at stake. Because the Senate was up for grabs in 2014, and part of the story of campaign finance is these laws were around for a long time. They were seriously, and they were challenged quite a bit, but the challenges became more frequent, and people were more willing to risk stretching or breaking the law when the stakes were higher. You've got a polarized Congress. You've got control of the chambers at risk. This is not the 1970s and 80s where the Democratic majority will come back. This is a time for change, and lots of groups really care and can make a huge difference to them. So the investments are up, the willing to take risks went up, and some of this spending took place before Citizens United, but once that happened, these groups were unleashed in ways that, if there wasn't competition, it wouldn't be so serious. So the answer to your question is, yeah, the Senate, it happens, and it happens even more so, particularly in those close races. Yes, please.
That's okay.
I can repeat the question.
Okay, yeah, no, it's on now.
I just have a point of clarity as a longtime union member. Union members actually have to opt in to, for their union to donate money to a political campaign. Dues cannot be used for political activities. You have to give extra money into the political action committee. So I just wanted to make that clear.
I appreciate that comment. There was a time, because I recall reading it, and I was part of a union where we didn't have that option.
So this is kind of a broad question, but I mean, how pessimistic are you? I mean, this is the way you're speaking. It's just like you could say, well, what's really become of American democracy when 100 people give such vast sums to candidates? Do you feel like democracy is really working at all, or is there hope for the future? Or?
Well, when you talk about money, you can't help but be a little cynical. But if we were to say something, a theme about American politics, I guess we'd say, it's the best government money can buy. That's a caricature. If we were to talk about Canadian politics with the Quebecois, the caricature is breaking up is hard to do. If we were to talk about third world countries that are trying to become emerging democracies, the issue is, what happened to your thumb? And that's because when people vote in elections in some of these places, the penalty for participation is to have your thumb cut off. So that's a kind of one answer. The other answer, which I start out all of my classes on elections with, is elections are really about conferring power. And conferring power can happen many ways. Way back in the old days of Og the caveman and barely or uncivilized societies, power was conferred among the person who was strongest and the most cunning, because that person was feared. During the days of monarchies and inherited positions, aristocracies, power was confirmed by birthright. Somewhere back there, one of your relatives was touched by God, and that makes you the Queen of England. At least, or either that or they fulfilled God's wishes. Then we look at places where rule is decided by co-optation of elites. The old Soviet Union, Russia, the Vatican. That's not so great either. And then there is when a state is so weak it can be invaded and defeated by another country, or the other obvious way is revolution. Well, revolutions are revolting. I mean, basically, people are so unhappy with the way things are, with the values their country pursues, with their opportunities, that they go around and kill relatives and neighbors. So this isn't so great, especially when you focus on the money, but think of the alternatives. And we do have cycles of reform, and we do have periods where people are so unhappy that they oust huge numbers of incumbents who routinely outspend their opponents. So, things are what they are. There also are periods of reform. And maybe we're around the corner from one. It would be very tough to reform any aspect of elections, especially money, but it's happened before, and it may happen again.
As an accounting major here at Case, I'm concerned about corporate reporting. So when a corporation donates to a campaign or a super PAC or 527 or 501c, I know some of those aren't disclosed on the political end, but as far as the corporation and their reporting, they have to report where that money goes. Can that be found on the financial statements where that money is going?
I'm not an accountant. The Securities and Exchange Commission could do what Congress failed to do, which is to require that reporting and make it public, or even require that stockholders decide it. But I don't think that's happening. And I don't think if it is, it's not happening in the way that people who are interested can trace the money and see which piper is paying for the tune.
Yeah, as a fellow accountant and a stockholder, I know over the past 2 or 3 years there have been hundreds of proxy fights over this issue. And a lot of companies have been forced to have a separate political report that they put out. Usually they just put it on their website and tell you, if you're interested, go to the website. And then they don't say anything more about it. But that's one way you can go look. A lot of the big corporations have to do it now.
So I've never been asked, when I've gotten these things from the stocks I own, which I'm a professor, there's not a lot, what do you think? Maybe I own the wrong stocks. But, yeah.
Well, if you look down there, one of the final questions, usually you'll have the shareholder proposals, and that's been a real hot button one. A lot of,
Interesting.
So I will make sure to check that.
Okay, well, maybe at some point this will be publicly available and in a convenient way, and it'll happen. Yes, Paul.
At the risk of sounding naive, I wonder what your take is on Tuesday's election in Seattle, which tosses out a lot of this stuff for local elections and puts limits on big corporations like Boeing and Starbucks. What do you think about that?
You know, I can't comment on Seattle. I'm not a follower of Washington state politics. I know that some of these referenda and some of these decisions will face court challenges, and whether they survive or not is an open question. It's a good question.
Yeah, hello. Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask a sort of similar question, which is what you think in terms of the courts and the courts' role in the creation of this new system, and whether you see any prospect for even any attempt at regulation being supported in the courts.
So when the courts make decisions, they're supposed to consider the law, especially the Constitution, and they're supposed to look to precedent and use that as a guide. And they also know that their decision does not end with the parties that are participating in the suit, but it extends to everyone and the future. And a long time ago, the Supreme Court gave corporations similar status as human beings. And in Citizens United, the decision was that corporate speech is like human speech, and free speech triumphs. It was a 5-4 decision. Some of those justices are old. This issue is not going to go away. And both Breyer and Ginsburg have publicly denounced this decision. We know where they stand. They've talked about it in their decision in a statement they released about hearing a case in Michigan. So will this survive? I think there will be more challenges. Maybe the law will change. If not, through the legislative process, possibly through the courts. We'll have to see. A really good scandal, though, is a great ingredient for reform. And maybe we need one of those as a triggering event. We'll just see.
Anybody else? In that case, okay.
So this might be a little bit off topic, but having seen these very large amounts of money that are contributed to some of these campaigns by corporations, is it actually economically in the interest of these corporations to make these contributions? It seems like the return on investment of getting somebody elected when you have to sink $10 million into their election can't possibly be particularly high, especially in these local elections.
Well, I think the answer is one that comes from the evidence. The corporations that contribute to these independent spending groups clearly think it's worthwhile. A small change in, and it's the same is true of unions, a small change in tax policy or regulatory policy can be worth millions and millions and millions, maybe billions of dollars to a group. Having a president that has a different take on regulation and directs an agency to move its oversight from one place to the other can have a tremendous effect. Having a Congress using oversight functions to look at your industry or look at a competitor industry can have huge consequences for various interests in the United States and abroad. So I think the fact that they're investing what seems like a lot of money to us, it may be peanuts to them. We can just look at the presidential election. Donald Trump, does anyone know how many contributions he's accepted? 0. He spent, the last report I read was $5 or $6 million. Maybe that's wrong, maybe it was more than that. But my point is, it's peanuts to him. This is doesn't mean much to him. So when you think about a billion-dollar multinational corporation, this may not be much to them. Think of the recent findings regarding Volkswagen. Imagine if there was a federal government that really didn't care about this. Maybe it wouldn't have come to light, or some other organization that didn't care about this, an international organization. So I think it matters. I think they see this as a good investment. And they may also feel that they have to contribute when it comes to a candidate, because if they don't, the candidate may not listen to them. Now, when it comes to these other groups, things are not publicly disclosed, but privately people know what's going on. So we'll see. I mean, that's my view. Yes?
You just described an investment with such a high rate of return, so in fact absurdly high, that the question would become, why don't corporations spend more? And if you can get 8% a year, that's the long-term rate of return on the S&P if you just invest in an index fund. You're suggesting an investment that is worth, I don't know how many thousands of percent, millions percent rate of return. So if the rate of return is that high, why not contribute far more money, given that they can?
Well, remember the ability to partake in this activity came after a Supreme Court ruling that was in the middle of the 2010 election. And at that point, in that election, 31% of the money that was spent by these new outside groups. 69% in 2010 came from the traditional groups that were in place, political action committees, for 40 years. So imagine you're a group, a corporation, union, whatever, and you've got your strategy all laid out. You've been raising money for your PAC. You've started contributing to various candidates, usually incumbents, early in the cycle. And then in the middle of the cycle, this ruling is handed down. That increase from very little, maybe nothing, well, not nothing, but very little money of outside money to 31% is huge. That's spinning on a dime. And the fact that it's now more than half is pretty huge. And we don't know. This is 2014. We don't know what the learning is. We don't know what these numbers will be in 2016. But you can see a candidate like Jeb Bush, who's got well over $100 million in this single candidate super PAC, and who knows how much in this single candidate social welfare organization, this 501c that supports his career. He's got all that money there. And that comes from somewhere. Comes from corporations, other organizations that believe in the Republican establishment. Without that money, he'd have no campaign. I mean, he's got the chorus singing before he has a bandwagon to build the money. So I don't know where it'll end, but I think the gist of your question is that there will be more.
A flip side to that also, though, which is that, the example that was originally given was $10,000 to a candidate, or $10 million to a candidate. Well, one candidate is 1 out of 100 or 435. That's a really bad investment. It doesn't necessarily get you anything. When you think of how many people there are to give money to, how many politicians there are to buy, how complicated the political system is in terms of what you actually have to do to actually make something happen, all the veto points and so on. Maybe it's not such a good investment. Maybe maybe it's sort of hard to get what you pay for.
Well, it's sort of, you're implying a little bit of bribery, and I'm not sure I would go that far. I sat in a congressman's office when he threw a union official out of the room because the union official said, "We backed you, you owe us." And he said, "Get out of my office. Don't ever say anything like that again, because if you do, I will have you fired." There is some contributions that are clearly motivated by the goal of influencing policy, and they go to incumbents. And some outside expenditures also are interested in changing who serves in elected office. There are other contributions given by people that pursue ideological goals. They know that what they want is not going to happen by getting access to a member, but they need to change who serves. And those contributions and expenditures, such as those on either side of the abortion issue, those are really targeted pretty much to close races, and so there is a difference here. Is it worth it? Again, I can only look at the data and say apparently so. And there's a lot of thought that goes into where this money is spent. There's a lot of thought that goes into the naming of the group, the front group that spends it. It's usually patriotic or innocuous. There was a group called USA, United Seniors Association. Sounds great. It was really the pharmaceutical companies. So there's a lot of thought that goes into that. And there's a lot of thought that goes into the ads that are run. And usually those advertisements have nothing to do with the group that's sponsoring them or the group's positions. But they're things that are meant to trip up candidates or help them.
So if you had to choose an approach to reform, would you emphasize limits on spending, or would you emphasize disclosure?
I would, well, first of all, I would just state that most Americans favor reform. Most people who give contributions of $200 or more favor reform. Most candidates for the nomination or general election favor reform. And most members of Congress favor reform. Once we get past that, they don't agree on much. I think disclosure is really important. I'm not sure that spending limits are going to be helpful because there will always end up being some way to get around them. What I think would be helpful would be to provide candidates, and this would be most helpful to challengers and open seat candidates, with some floor, some basic level of funding that they can use to launch a campaign and to get out enough of a message to appear viable, which can help them attract more resources, become more visible, and start that bandwagon effect that's necessary to succeed in the campaign for resources and do well in the campaign for votes. I think that's where I would start. Of course, if you have a free market ideology, then you would say, hey, that's welfare for politicians, so there would be opposition to that. But I think if the value is competition, which I believe in, I think I would start with providing some basic foundation of resources, whether it's money, free media time, franked mail like members of Congress get, things like that.
How do you decide which challenger gets the money?
Oh, I wouldn't use public opinion polls. I think it'd be very difficult in the nomination, but I think in the general election, probably major party candidates would automatically qualify. Members of third parties or independent candidates that had performed at a threshold level would qualify. Those who didn't would be eligible for reimbursement of some sort if they did reach a certain level after the campaign. The rules are never neutral. And clearly these would benefit some people over others, but that's the way it is with the current rules.
I think the rules are never neutral, may be a good place to end this discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Paul Herndsen.
Thank you. A good member of Congress is a great candidate because the job is what we would want. Expectations. Everyone expects the incumbent to get reelected. That has an effect on the next thing here, the quality of the opposition. Why would someone who is a strong potential congressional candidate, a really quality, well-qualified, liked politician, run against an incumbent when the odds of success are so slim? Usually they don't. They wait for the incumbent to retire, or maybe some kind of scandal, or maybe pass away. They wait till the seat is open. And that brings us to the cycle of self-fulfilling prophecies. Incumbents have these great advantages. They face challengers who maybe aren't the strongest challengers, if they face any at all, and they win. So it just becomes a cycle. And all of this occurs before the campaign season. Now, the two campaigns. The campaign for resources is a campaign for contributions, endorsements, and very important, and more recently, outside support. The timing, it begins much, much earlier than the campaign for votes. People start raising money very early, especially incumbents. The geography, it's nationwide. You can only get votes in your district or for the Senate, your state. But when it comes to money, politicians go where the money is, and that's Washington, D.C. and its environs, New York City and its environs, Los Angeles, that area, Houston, we know the places. It also involves targeting, messaging, and techniques. Knowing who's likely to give to you, knowing a message that will help you raise money, and knowing which techniques work for which donors. The campaign for votes we're all familiar with. It involves targeting, figuring out what groups of voters you need to assemble your winning coalition, coming up with a message that's thematic, that defines your campaign, a champion of middle-class values, a conservative who'll work for you. You've heard these things. It requires all sorts of communications. Direct mail, radio, television, the internet, person-to-person communications, each of which
Welcome to this session on the new and old politics of congressional elections, hosted by the Center for Policy Studies here at Case Western Reserve University. I'm Joe White, the director of the center, and it is a great pleasure to welcome not only all of you, but also Professor Paul Herndsen. Paul went to the University of Connecticut in 2013 as professor, and before that he earned his PhD in political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, taught at the University of Massachusetts, and then spent 24 years at the University of Maryland, including 13 as director of the Center for American Politics and Citizenship. During this time, he has been an incredibly productive researcher on subjects including congressional elections, the mechanisms of elections, campaign finance, political parties, and interest groups. His book, Congressional Elections, Campaigning at Home and in Washington, is a superb text on this topic. It's used in courses across the country, and in some sense, just the title became part of the sort of, oh, yeah, that is how it worked when he started, when he published the book. There is campaigning, there are two parts of the campaign here. It was first published in 1995. And the 7th edition will be released shortly. And since he did the research for the first edition, there seem to have been substantial changes in congressional elections, particularly, but not limited to, the rules about campaign finance. So, just before the new edition comes out, it is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Herndsen here for a talk and discussion, and in a way, a sneak preview on the new version of the book.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks to the Center for Political Studies and Case Western Reserve University for having me out here to give this talk. I'm just very delighted to be here, and I thank you all for coming on this beautiful day. So The new and old politics of congressional elections, of the increasing number of women in Congress and in other offices, is that they are now part of the candidate pool. There are more women who occupy positions that are stepping stones, state legislative seats, local offices. They graduate from law schools, they run businesses. So that is part of the story of why things were slow, but why women are increasingly found in Congress. The next things, incumbency advantages. I put 90%, but it's more typically 95%. When you look at two-party contested races, incumbents win overwhelmingly. Their advantages come from many different sources. Probably one of the most important one occurs prior to the campaign, but then they have advantages in the campaign for resources and the campaign for votes. So we'll look at those. Pre-election advantages. District composition. Well, they were elected there once before, and usually the partisanship of the district closely matches the incumbent's party. There is an advantage. Visibility. Incumbents in a lot of places are sort of recognized. They're local celebrities. The perks of office. You cannot underestimate this. Incumbents have nice offices in the nation's capital, nice offices in their districts. They have franked mail, free telephone, free internet presence, and they have a staff, including a press secretary whose sole job is to educate their member, serve constituents, and if they ever forget that their jobs are dependent on the incumbent's reelection, there's a chief of staff or administrative assistant to remind them. Media coverage. Incumbents get lots of media coverage. When I worked for Congress, we had a very good press secretary, and she would place articles on behalf of our member all the time. And she also had a weekly radio recording. And she would tape the congressman, send it out, and 6 or 7 radio shows played it as if it was a live radio show. The job description. Members of Congress make laws. They represent their districts, their voters. They help their constituents with the federal government. They help them with casework. They oversee the bureaucracy, they educate the public, they do lots of things, which affords different amounts of control. Direct mail, you have a lot of control. You know exactly what you're saying, you know exactly who it's going to. Television, less control because more people watch stations, there's more diversity. Same thing with radio, although if you pick an oldie station and you do it during rush hour, your ad is going to be heard by a group of people that you can guess their age. Social media, the least control. Things go viral. Sometimes they may hurt you. And then there's what I've got put up here, and you're all familiar with voter mobilization. Getting the people who support your candidacy to vote, getting the people that are likely to support your candidacy to vote, and sometimes dissuading, discouraging people who are likely to support the opponent. We're familiar with this. So, campaign for resources. Incumbent advantages. First, they have an experienced organization. They've worked with a fundraiser, or several of them often, for years. They know what they're doing. And that organization comes with its connections. It comes with the record of where the congressman or congresswoman raised money, and with contacts with donors who have contributed to other like-minded candidates. There is a tried and true fundraising list and pitch. When a contribution comes in, the amount is recorded, the medium, whether it was the internet, direct mail, a fundraiser is recorded, the kind of message that was given to the person was recorded. So instead of going out there and prospecting and hoping to find a contribution, incumbents, they know where to go. They know who's given before. Very important, money is drawn to power. As a member of Congress or some other elected official, you have the ability to influence public policy. And guess what? Your opponent, the challenger, that is not the case. Again, expectations kick in. Everyone expects the incumbents to win, except for a few cases, the competitive seats, and even there, the odds are pretty good. And so money flows, because for many donors, a contribution is an investment to gain access. The old ones. Candidacies are critical to representation. Incumbency confers major advantages. the campaign finance system favors some over others. The new ones, new communications media, what I would now call a new campaign finance system, as opposed to a disintegrated old one, and Republican Party ascendance in Congress. Old politics. Candidacies influence representation. And the story here is to run to get represented. You can't beat somebody with nobody, and if you care deeply about someone representing your issues, your ideology, or perhaps your gender, you need to get them to run or run yourself. Why do we have a Congress of mostly middle-aged, maybe some older, affluent, white male churchgoers? Well, one reason is the incumbency advantage. There's very low turnover in congressional elections. The other example, or the other reason, is the nature of the candidate pool. And the example I will refer to is, or look at, is women. When women run, it's quite clearly women win. We can see that women are about 51% of the population. In 2014, they were 17% of the candidates for the nomination for either major party. They won their nomination and were general election candidates 19% of the time, and now they're 19% of the House members. Women's candidacies by party. This reinforces the point. You can see that bars go nomination candidates, general election candidates, House members, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. If you look at the Democrats, you get 24% who ran for the nomination, 27% who won the nomination, and 33% who became House members. For Republicans, the numbers are lower, 12, 12, and 9, but still, the candidacies are key to getting elected. Now, I choose women because they're a rising group. There are other rising groups in politics, and part of the story